talk is about the rule of 1978 and the effect that it has had on our order in New Zealand. It's not about what we could or should have done, but about what actually has happened here in this country. I can do this because I joined the order before the new rule came into being. It happened like this. My husband Michael used to go to the Franciscan retreat house in Hillsborough for retreats because the friars used to run weekend retreats for men from different parishes. In 1974, Michael came home from his retreat and said, "The friars are going to run a retreat for women, and I've put your name down." This was something new for the friars, and for me too, because I'd never been to a retreat. Also attending this retreat was Maureen Hazeldine, who is now a member of West Auckland Fraternity. Maureen told me that she had been attending meetings of the Third Order of St. Francis, held at the retreat house on Sunday afternoons, and she suggested that I go along too. So one thing led to another, and eventually I became professed in 1976. At that time, I would not have described myself as a secular Franciscan, because we didn't use the word secular until after the new rule in 1978. I might have called myself a lay Franciscan, but most probably I would have just said I was a member of the Third Order of St. Francis. Fraternity life before the new rule was much like it is now, but with a few differences. The old rule had been abrogated, and there was an interim rule in existence. In an article in 2005, Father Lucian Armstrong said, "In Sydney, under the guidance of Peter Keogh and Father Leonard Gleeson, a number of us worked long and hard on producing the skeleton of a new rule, as did groups around the world. And so, sometime in the 70s, we came up with an interim way of life for lay Franciscans, approved for Australia and New Zealand. This interim way of life was sent to the experts in Rome, with all other suggestions from around the world, and we like to think that we had some input into the rule promulgated by Pope Paul VI in 1978. The first article of the interim rule said, "Those who join the Third Order commit themselves to live the Holy Gospel according to the spirit and life of St. Francis. To this end, they seek a Christ-centered spirituality, a sharing in Christ's mystery by loving the Father and remaining open to the action of the Holy Spirit. Guided by the Spirit, they earnestly endeavour to share in the life and mission of the Church." When I joined, I was told that the order was run jointly by the friars and the members. In those days, the spiritual assistants played a more prominent role than they do now. Our meetings began with Mass in the Retreat House Chapel, and then we moved into the fireplace room, and the fraternity minister dealt with any business. The secret bag was passed around. This is something that hasn't changed. She then turned to the spiritual assistant and said, "And now, Father, it's over to you." The spiritual assistant would then conduct the rest of the meeting, and we would all settle down in our chairs and listen to a lovely talk on Franciscan spirituality. The new rule changed the role of the spiritual assistant. In fact, it gave them that title of assistant to emphasize that the primary responsibility was with us, the members. However, we weren't entirely passive. I can remember being asked to think about certain things and come back with ideas for the next meeting. We were also sometimes asked to give talks. At that time, Maureen and I were full-time mothers coping with very young children. And I can remember Maureen giving a wonderful talk about family life. And I thought about that when I heard that the theme for 2019, which has been suggested to us by Cheoffs, is the family. The opening words of Chapter 3 of the New Rule. The secular Franciscan order is divided into fraternities of various levels: local, regional, national, and international. Today we hardly give these words a second thought, but in 1978 the only fraternities here were local ones. In 1978 there were several fraternities in Auckland and one in Hamilton, Palmerston North, Wellington and Christchurch. There had been fraternities in Dunedin and in Invercargill, but these were no longer operating. These fraternities had no connection with each other except through the friars, who travelled around and knew people. It was decided that the New Zealand fraternities would become a region and be part of a national fraternity of Oceania, which was in the process of being formed. To start with, this Oceania National Fraternity was made up of regions: New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, South Australia and West Australia. Later it included Singapore and Sabah, and sometimes people from Papua New Guinea came to chapter meetings. We were the second biggest region after New South Wales. 1982 was the 800th anniversary of the birth of St. Francis. In order to celebrate this, and also in order to form a New Zealand region, it was decided to hold 3 congresses or gatherings of members from all the fraternities then existing. Some new fraternities had been recently formed as a result of the work of Father Carl Schaefer, who held meetings in the retreat house dining room on Sunday evenings, telling people about the order and inviting them to join. Waiheke and South Auckland fraternities began meeting in 1979, Hibiscus Coast in 1980, and North Shore and Hokitika in 1981. The first Congress was held in Hamilton 29 to 31 January 1982. It was in Hamilton because that was the largest fraternity at the time. It was very exciting because we were meeting people from other parts of the country for the first time. The 2 main speakers at that Congress were Betty White, who founded the Waiheke fraternity, and Ron Kennedy, who was the minister of Hamilton fraternity. Betty gave an inspiring talk about Francis and Clare and a visit she made to Assisi. And I can still remember that Ron spoke about beans, green beans, climbing beans like scarlet runners. To grow this type of beans you need a structure. A good structure will help to produce a good crop of beans, but the most important thing is the beans. We were in the process of developing a structure, the Regional Fraternity of New Zealand, and it seemed to me to be a good analogy. The second Congress was held in Wellington and hosted by the Wellington Fraternity, and then a third one in Auckland in October. And after that, we were officially the New Zealand region with an elected regional council. At these congresses, we were supported by our spiritual assistants, OFM and Capuchin, and by people from the newly developing Oceania National Fraternity to which we belonged. The The Oceania National Council was in touch with the International Council and was our link with the international level. Being a region brought new needs and responsibilities. One of our problems was, and probably still is, the fact that we have small fraternities scattered over a wide geographic area, and yet we need to keep in touch. For this reason, the lay Franciscan came into existence, and it has had various editors over the years, and currently it is Anne Rodriguez. This is a very important link, and we are indebted to the editors who have worked so hard to produce it for us. We also began the 3 yearly elective chapters with council meetings in the in-between years, when representatives from all the fraternities meet together for a weekend. All these things need funding, and so there was a need for levies, which is in Article 25 of the rule. Article 26 of the rule talks about spiritual assistance. Prior to the new rule, the fraternities were seen as belonging to the friars of the First Order, which established them. And in some countries of the world, there were fraternities who considered themselves to be either Capuchin or OFM fraternities, and they had separate gatherings, which were fraternities which had spiritual assistance of the same kind. After the new rule, the friars were asked to work cooperatively to support us. In New Zealand, this was never a problem, because the friars have always helped us cooperatively. But this is why we have a national spiritual assistant from each of the first orders. Article 8 of the rule says, "Let them join in liturgical prayer in one of the forms proposed by the Church, reliving the mysteries of the life of Christ." Before the new rule, there was a variety of ways in which people fulfilled this requirement, one of them being saying 12 Our Fathers, Hail Marys and Glory Bees each day. There were other things. And in 1975 I had a small office book, very beautiful and very Franciscan. It was called The Layman's Order Divine Office, and it contains 15 psalms compiled by St. Francis, 15 hymns for the liturgical seasons, and a list of Bible readings for every day of the year. However, we had nothing we could say together. Then Father Joachim O'Brien, who was National Spiritual Assistant for Oceania, came here on a visit and showed us the office book we now use. He said it was available at a reasonable price and suggested that we all start using it. This has happened, and now we enjoy being able to say the office together at our meetings, but it wasn't always this way. We were part of the Oceania National Fraternity for about 30 years, until 2010, when we became a national fraternity. As part of Oceania, we received an enormous amount of help in becoming established as a region and in understanding what we should be doing. Many of us went to chapter meetings and other events held in Australia, and we learned much from our Australian cousins. Special mention must be made of Peter Keogh, the first minister of the Oceania National Council. Peter was a businessman who had to make trips to New Zealand for the company he worked for, and he used this as a way of keeping in touch. He would ring me from Sydney and say something like, "I'm going to be in Auckland next week, and I'll keep Thursday night free if you can get some people together for a meeting." These would usually be small, informal meetings and very encouraging. Other times we managed to get a bigger group together, and Peter would speak off the cuff, always urging us on to greater efforts. He had a great love for Francis and Clare and a great knowledge of Assisi. He took several groups of people on tours to Assisi and other Franciscan places in Italy. To go back to the international scene, in 1984 a new ritual was approved and we're still using it. A new rule means that there is the need for new general constitutions because they expand the rule and give us more guidelines. In 1988, a chapter was held in Rome to approve new constitutions. As was done with the rule, fraternities from around the world had been asked to send in their ideas and suggestions. I was very privileged to be at that chapter as one of the representatives from Oceania, along with Peter Keogh and Father Joachim O'Brien, who came as our national spiritual assistant. The meetings were conducted in 5 languages: Italian, Spanish, English, French and German. And we had the assistance of people who provided simultaneous translation. We worked our way through all the suggestions for each article, one by one, and there are 103 articles, so it was a big job. We met in language groups, and I had the honour of being the secretary of the English-speaking group, and it was good to be able to do something useful. Peter Keogh chaired our discussions, and the group had members from England, Ireland, Canada, the USA, South Africa, Tanzania, India, and the Philippines. We met in a general session of the whole chapter and reported back on our group's decisions. I learnt that I had to speak very slowly and clearly so that my words could be translated into other tongues. After all the groups had reported back, we had a vote on the final wording. We worked very hard and long, but were also given some treats. We had a day off and were taken by bus to Assisi, and were even given dinner in the Sacro Convento, the home of the conventual friars. And on one other special morning, we were taken to the Vatican and had an audience with Pope John Paul II. We now have our handbook, which contains the rule, ritual, constitutions, and the national statutes. The national statutes were approved on the 29th of June 2013 and are the result of work done by Shirley McGinley, our first national minister, with assistance from George Pearce and others. We have come a long way in the last 40 years, and when I think back over this time, I am aware of all the people, fraternity members and spiritual assistants who have contributed so much to our fraternity life. Some of them are no longer with us and have gone on to their heavenly reward. Over this time we have grown in our understanding of what our rule asks us to be and to do, and I hope it will spur us on to greater things.